So, Lamentations 3:19 to 24. It says, "The thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him." Therefore I will hope in him. Now, today we don't really appreciate poets anymore as much, right? But in the past, poets are actually what? They were actually highly respected people. They play important roles in the society. So they, especially when they're like something bad that actually happens in a society, usually poets come and they actually what? They try to capture the moment, right? With the words, with their words. They're trying to capture the moment, right? I think that's pretty much part of the tasks of poets in the past, okay? When we look at the prophets, so we're assuming here that the author of Lamentations is actually a prophet. If you read Jeremiah, Isaiah, you probably noticed that they were actually what? Poets. Do you guys notice that they're very what? They're very poetic, right? And Lamentations is also a very poetic work. So I'm assuming this must have been written by what? Some kind of a poet during that time. Okay. Usually what happened here is this: when there's some kind of a historical calamity that happens, a poet will come and try to what? Capture the moment with their beautiful words, okay? Try to express the pain that people are actually what? Experiencing. So during this time, this is actually the destruction of Jerusalem, okay? And what happened is that the people of Jerusalem were actually exiled by the Babylonians. This is the context. And that's the reason why the author of Lamentations is trying to what? Capture this historical calamity, okay? King Nebuchadnezzar actually exiled the people of Jerusalem. So, in a way, let me put it this way. Some people claim, like, for example, how many of you heard of the name Nietzsche before? Right? A philosopher, right? Friedrich Nietzsche. Probably Matt's favorite or something like that, right? Nietzsche said, poets are shameless with their experiences. They exploit them. What they do, they exploit what? The experiences that they have, right? They try to, in some sense, with some kind of an exaggeration, right? They try to exploit the sufferings that they have. But somehow, by doing that, they capture something about what? About reality, okay? Now, a rabbi named Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel described the poet as something similar, right? According to this rabbi, he said, poets or prophets, they have a tendency to actually what? Exaggerate their sufferings. So, for example, when we think about people cheating in their businesses or exploiting the poor, for many of us, we call that injustice. But for the prophets, it's a disaster. Right? You guys follow me? They tend to exaggerate in some sense, right? So for us, when we think about, the injustices that were actually done to some people, so for example, the welfare of the people, to the prophets, for them, it's a death blow to existence. Right? To us, some kind of a catastrophe, for the prophets, it's actually a threat. Do you guys follow me here? Right? So according to this rabbi, so in a way, poets and prophets are very what? Very similar. So I have a feeling here that the prophets are actually what? Poets. They were actually poets during their time. Okay? Now, the poet in Lamentations recognized that the destruction of his city was just a punishment from God due to Israel's sin. So what the poet is trying to do is trying to actually appeal to the people. He wants them to what? Repent. He wants them to actually plead for what? For God's mercy and for God's compassion. And in some sense, that somehow gave hope to the poet. Now, one thing that the poet realized is this: the wrath of God has limits, but the mercy and compassion of God has no what? Has no limits. That's what he recognized in Lamentations, right? The wrath of God has what? Limits, but the mercy and compassion of God has no limits. Now, so what we're going to try to do here is this. We're going to try to figure out a way how to apply this to our lives. Okay. I'm assuming this one has some kind of a macrocosmic scope. When you think of, it's not just something that happened to them. Because for us, when we suffer, we also look for what? We look for insights. We look for what? We look for insights. We look for insights from the author of Lamentations and see whether we can actually what? Respond to God in very similar ways. Because it looks like he captured something here, right? About sufferings. So let's look at this. So let me begin by my first point here. I will call this living with hopelessness. Remember, if you notice the first part of the reading, okay, so let me read it again. He said, "The thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it." My soul continually thinks of the affliction, right? "And it's bowed down within me." Okay. So that means, at first, he was living with what? Hopelessness here, in some sense. Okay. So, in verses 19 to 20, the poet actually kept on thinking about what? The bad things that he experienced. The affliction here has something to do with what? The destruction of Jerusalem. And the homelessness has something to do with what? Being exiled. So he used the word affliction and what? Homelessness. Affliction has something to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. Homelessness has something to do with being what? Exiled. Okay. Now, that led to bitterness of spirit and deep resentment. And that's what it meant when it says wormwood and gall. Okay. Bitterness of spirit and what? Resentment. Okay. Deep resentment. The poet seemed to recognize that there are thoughts that lead to despair. There are thoughts that lead to what? Despair. I'm pretty sure we're aware of this, right? And we have Matt here. He's the counseling guy. Okay. Right. I don't know. I'm not an expert on this, but I know there's what they call in psychotherapy, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy, something like that. The assumption in cognitive behavioral therapy is that your thoughts, your emotions, and your behaviors, they somehow what? Influence each other. You guys follow me here? What you're thinking, well, can affect your what? Your emotion. It can also affect your behavior. Right, the way you behave will also affect the way you think and how you feel, and the way you feel, right, will also affect what you're thinking. Do you guys follow me here? Right, they seem to be somehow interconnected in some sense. And then Mr. Matt can actually correct me on this one, right? Because I didn't study this in school. Okay. Now, so what they're trying to do in this kind of therapy is they try to change how you're thinking, because it's supposed to help you. For those people who are actually suffering from what? Negative thoughts. What they try to do is they try to help them what? Change their minds or change their thinking. Okay. And I think this is what is somehow assumed here too, by the poet, right? Somehow you can change your what? By changing what you're thinking, that can also change how you actually look at your problems. You guys follow me here? By changing what you're thinking, this can actually change how you look at what? The problems that you have. Now, so there are things that we do that somehow affect our emotions and our behaviors, even as believers. Okay? So, for example, one, when we constantly think about our sufferings or afflictions, conditions that cause negative emotions or damaging psychological states, they're actually what? Created. Right? The more you constantly think about your what? Your problem. It happens to all of us, right? It happens to me too. Right? The more you actually think about your problems, right? What happened to you? You start having fear. You start having anger. You start having hatred. You start having emotional stressors. Right? You start feeling pity for yourself. Right? You start blaming other people. Does that make sense for our sufferings? Isn't that what happened to all of us? Yes. Okay. Right. So I'm aware that some of these things that happen to us are probably involuntary in some sense, but some of them are probably what? Voluntary. We somehow create it. Right? We constantly think about things. And again, there are legitimate problems, especially when you lost your job, for example. what happens? You will constantly think about things. You'll wonder about, how I'm going to pay the bills, right? How am I going to actually survive? I have kids, blah, 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 right? When you actually found out that you are terminally ill, of course, you will actually what? You will be thinking about all these things, right? So somehow you can't help but actually worry about many things. Now, so that's one, right? So we have sometimes some of our problems have something to do with the fact that we're constantly thinking about our afflictions. Right? Is that clear? Another thing that we do is this. We somehow probably exaggerate the intensity, right, of our sufferings. You're not the only one guilty of this. I'm guilty of this too. Okay. Sometimes we what? We exaggerate, right? Am I making sense here? Yes. I don't know if that's correct, right? Do we somehow exaggerate it sometimes? Yes. Okay. Or probably most of the time. Okay. And this creates what? Negative emotions every time we try to exaggerate the problems. Okay. We humans are inclined to actually exaggerate the level of the intensity of our sufferings or afflictions. We what? We exaggerate the level of our suffering, the intensity of our sufferings. Sometimes it's not just you, but this happens to me too, right? I naturally crave for what? Dramatic effects. Right? I'm assuming, right? Are we all guilty of this somehow, or am I the only one who's guilty of this? I'm the only one. Okay. So the message is for me then, right? Right. Right. So in some sense, sometimes we actually create our own what? Our own problems by actually doing that. So how do we exaggerate the nature of our problems? Most of the time, I think one of our problems too, I think it's not just you, a problem is with me too. We somehow think that there's something extremely special about us. Do you guys follow me here? Yeah, sometimes I feel that too, right? There's something, something must be extremely special about me, and that's the reason why I'm going to start thinking about what? My problems here. Right, so a teenager who thinks that he's the only one who struggles with his lust, without knowing that all teenagers, go through the same exact what? Same exact thing, right? Or a person who complains about the regular quarrels with the spouse, about minor issues, okay? Without thinking that that's actually what happens to what? To everyone, even to pastors, right? This is the things that happen to them too. Now, or a college student who will actually think that, passing an exam or turning a paper is like life and death situation. Do you guys follow me here? Or the person who thought that because his star won't start, right, that it must be the devil, right? Who's actually, is that clear? Blaming the devil for the car not starting, right? Now, but the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes we have this tendency to actually what? Exaggerate our problems, right? But Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:13, no testing has overtaken you that is not common to what? Everyone. Does that make sense? Yes. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and He will not let you be tested beyond your strength, according to Paul. But with the testing, He will also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it. Right? That's what he said, right? So whether you want to agree with that or not, it's up to you, right? But the point I'm trying to make is that, at least from the standpoint of Paul, he thinks that whatever sufferings you have, that is seemingly common to what? To people. And I think once you recognize that should help you out. When we were thinking about, this church, and then, our third Sunday, last Sunday, I was getting a little worried, right, whether we should do this or not, right? And then when I read other people who planted churches and they have the same exact experiences, I feel encouraged. I say, it's not just me, right? I thought I was just I think I was exaggerating my problem here, right? Now, so nothing is really special about our sufferings, right? Always remember that your sufferings are sufferings that you share in common with what? With others. What's the worst suffering that you ever have gone through, right, that is uniquely your own? There's nothing really unique, right? My wife and I lost a child. But other people also what? lost their children too. So it's not just us. Does that make sense? Suppose, a whole family died in some kind of a car accident. But those things happen to other people as well. But what do people do when they encounter those kind of sufferings? They just move on. You guys follow me? They just move on. It doesn't matter what the suffering is. People just what? They just move on. Okay? But God is faithful. Okay? God is faithful. So, you will not be allowed to suffer beyond your own what? Your own strength. That's what Paul said. Okay? Now, let's look at the next, another point here. We exaggerate our problem, by actually putting additional elements into how we actually tell the stories about our sufferings. I think sometimes the problems have something to do with the narratives that we tell ourselves. We should ask the counselor whether this is even plausible, right? Yeah, there you go, right? Did you guys follow me here? Like, it's the way we actually what? Create the narrative, the story. And probably that's the reason why, we feel miserable sometimes. But sometimes probably what we just need to do is try changing what? The stories that we tell ourselves. Sometimes we just need to be what? Be very modest. Be very modest when we actually evaluate our what? Our life experiences, our challenges, our sufferings. Do you guys? Does that make sense? Or try to even incorporate God in your story, right? How God can actually be what? Faithful to you, even in times of need. Okay. Now, another thing here is this. Many times we consider our sufferings as what? As threats. And again, I will rely on some clinical psychologists here again, right? Their advice is that you avoid treating potential stressors as what? As threats. Does that make sense? You treat them as what? Challenges rather than threats. Okay. Now, let's move to the positive part here, right? Living with hope. Okay. So we're almost done, right? So it looks like we're going to be done early today. Living with hope. Now, verse 21 says something like this. So let's look at verse 21 again. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have what? Hope. Now, what is this? This I call to mind. This. What is that referring to? This I call to mind, and then I ended up with what? With hope. What is that? Verse 22, it says, the steadfast love of the Lord never what? Ceases, and His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your what? Faithfulness. Now, the poet, according to him, right? He changed what he was actually what? Thinking. He started thinking about what? The steadfastness of God's love. The never-endingness of what? God's mercies. And then he started thinking about God's what? Faithfulness. Hope, at least for the author of Lamentations, was actually restored through remembrance. Say that with me. Hope was actually restored through what? Remembrance. There's something good about remembering things. Right? There's something good about what? Remembering things. The poet started remembering or thinking about the love and mercy of God. Now, the firmly established love of God never ceases, according to him. God never stops loving His people. Even when you fail to love God, God's love is somehow what? Firmly established. That's what he's affirming here. Okay? He still loves them. Now, the firmly established love of God was not shaken by the wrongdoings. Again, this is the thing that he's trying to remind himself. We might have done some wrong, right? But what he kept on thinking is that, but God's love is what? Steadfast. Right? It was simply given to them. God's mercies were not given to us because we deserve God's mercies. No. If you receive God's mercies before you even do anything good, right? So it looks like you're not going to lose, you're not going to be prevented from receiving God's mercies just because you're doing something what? Something bad. Okay. I'm not encouraging you to do something bad. Okay? That's not what I'm trying to ask you to do. But I'm simply pointing out that is the nature of God's love. That's the nature of what? Of God's mercies, at least according to the poet. Okay. The greatness of God's faithfulness. Now, so here's the foundation of living with hope. Okay. Now, what was the problem with the people during the time of Lamentation when this book was actually written? How come they ended up, with this destruction? Now, according to the author of Lamentations, here's the problem with them. We're not going to read this anymore, but this is in Lamentations 2:14. It pointed out that the problem with them is that they had false confidence on the words of what? False prophets. And that's why God what? Destroyed them. They had false confidence on what? The words of false prophets. Right? Now, the false prophets did not expose the sin of God's people. That was the problem. I think they were trying to make them feel what? Good about themselves. Is that clear? Instead of exposing their sins, what did the false prophets, what did they do? They were making them feel good about themselves in some sense. Right? The cause of false confidence was the captivity of God's people in the hands of their enemies. That's what happens, according to the author of Lamentations. Now, let's try to apply that to ourselves. What is the nature of our false confidence today? We also have our own false confidence, right? Do we suffer from this too as well? Right? So, for example, we have false confidence on our material resources. But we all know this, right? Earthly wealth does not have eternal significance. It has limited and temporary value. Money, for example, right? They come and what? They go, right? Comes and goes. After payday, right? We seem to have a lot of money, okay? Right? In our bank account. But after paying our regular bills, right? You barely even have anything what? Anything left. Money can be stolen. Money can be spent. Money can be lost. Money can be burned. Right? Even when you actually buy fine jewelries. Some of them, you bought them for a very big price, and when you get it appraised, somehow it went down, right? And you wonder why. I remember, I bought Florence a nice ring for when I proposed. Okay, right? But I felt so bad because the first one I gave her was a fake one. I got it from the Philippines. I thought it was real. It turns out I was fooled, right? And then Florence was like, oh, this looks like it's fake, right? And I felt so bad. I was like, you know what? I'm going to buy you a nice one, right? And I saved a lot of money, right? And then before I proposed to her, I gave her this very, very expensive ring. But when we got it appraised, guess what? It went, the price is like probably, it went down like probably 80% or something like that of what I spent. Now, because it goes down, right? Homes that you purchase, sometimes, probably now it's okay right now, the economy, right? But it will go down too at some point, right? Do you guys follow me here? It happened to us, remember the budget crisis, right? A few years ago. Now, so the home that you bought for $500, right? $500,000 becomes what? $300, $200, okay? Now, when you buy a nice new car, okay? The value of that car actually goes down already, right? The moment you probably step out of the car dealer. The investment, a lot of people lost their investment. Now you have to understand that the value of material resources depends on the economy of our nation. It fluctuates depending on things that are happening around us. So no one can really braggingly say that my hope for the future ultimately depends on my material possessions. Is that clear? Right? We have false confidence on our physical abilities. But we all know our physical abilities are not permanent. Aging is the constant enemy of our physical abilities. Right? When I was a younger person, when I was a teenager, right, I could play basketball for 4 or 5 hours, right? With no breaks in between. Okay, but now I can barely even run. Okay, are you guys following here? Every time I'm running to class from the parking lot, and then when I get to the classroom, I'm sweating, and then I tell my students, you know what? I'm really out of shape. I just came from the parking lot. That was it. It's not even that far, right? Now, no amount of exercise can make you healthy forever. At some point, your health will actually what? It will deteriorate. No one can really braggingly say that my hope for the future ultimately depends on my physical strength. Right? We also have false confidence on our mental abilities. But we all know it's not just our physical abilities that go through what? Deterioration. But it's also what? Mental abilities. Is that clear? Of course, our intelligence probably improves as we get older, but at some point it reaches its peak. Okay, mine, I think it reaches its peak 5 years ago, right? And I think I'm like on the, I'm going down right now, okay? Right? I tend to forget a lot of things already, right? I remember before when I teach a class, I'm like and I know the names of all these philosophers, but right now I'm like, trying to figure out how come I forgot their names, right? I can't even remember the books that they wrote. Something is wrong here, right? So no one can really braggingly say that my hope for the future ultimately depends on my mental abilities, right? We have false confidence on people. Another one, right? Sometimes the people whom we can depend on are the ones who first disown us. Isn't that weird? Yes. Right. I think it happens. Probably for some of us, we have those experiences. We have seen husbands or wives left their spouses. Right. We have seen children who left their parents. We have seen parents who left their what? Their children. So these are the people you're supposed to be depending on, right? We have seen brothers and sisters who actually disown their siblings. Right? We have seen friends who left each other. Right? It's like even friends from even childhood, right? I think in the Philippines they used to say, those people who are like, if I get you as the ninang of my son, right? They say magbali ka na ng kandila, something like that, right? So now many forms of human relationships are actually what? Fragile. So here's what I'm going to say. No one can really braggingly say that my hope for the future ultimately depends on my family or families or friends. Does that make sense? Right? We have false confidence on our jobs. Okay. Another false confidence. But no one can, but you can be really confident about your job because you can easily lose your jobs too, right? So no one can really braggingly say that my hope for the future ultimately depends on my job. Right? The last one. We have false confidence on the government. Right? And we all know many people now losing confidence, right? Whoever is the president. What makes it possible for us to claim that we can truly be confident on God, right? The level of our confidence depends on what? The person's character. If you want to be confident about another person, you have to rely on what? The character and trustworthiness. Okay? So here's what I'm going to suggest, right? Because this is what the Bible tells us. We can be confident on God because of God's steadfast love. Meaning His love is somehow immovable or what? Unchangeable. Is that clear? Okay. At least that's the claim of the Bible. Okay. God loves us in spite of our lack of love for Him. God loves us in spite of the fact that we are unlovable. We are all unlovable people, right? In some sense, right? At least from the standpoint of God. So God's love is gracious in a sense that it is not based on the merit of what we do, right? Is that clear? Now, another thing is God's mercies and God's compassion. Now, if God is not merciful or compassionate, we cannot be truly confident on God. Okay. If He is not merciful or compassionate, He will definitely abandon us when we continually fail in following His will. But we have this tendency to constantly what? Sin against God. Right? We have this tendency to constantly what? Disobey God. We have this the tendency to ignore God. Right? But again, the thing is, it's not dependent on us. God's mercies is not dependent on what? It's not dependent on us. Okay. Another thing is God's faithfulness. Okay. God's faithfulness guarantees that His steadfast love and never-ending mercies, right, will continue. Because God is what? Faithful. God's faithfulness in the past is a proof that God will be faithful to fulfill His promises for the future. God's faithfulness when? In the past. Right? And we can rely on God because He was faithful to us when? In the past. Okay. Now, what are the basis of our claim that God's love is steadfast, that His mercies are never ending, and that God is faithful? How do we know that? Is that clear? That's a good question to ask, right? How do we know that? One is this: the biblical witness. The Bible provides us with written accounts of God's action within what? Human history. You guys know that the story in the Bible is the story of God's what? Faithfulness. You see the Israelites, right? You know, they were actually what? They keep on sinning, right? They ignore God. They want to disobey God. But God what? You see God's love, right? You see God's mercies. And you see God's faithfulness. Is that clear? Look at humans, all of us. We keep on sinning, we keep on disobeying God, we keep on disowning God. But somehow, God still gave us what? Jesus. Okay. You know that Jesus is the embodiment of God's steadfast love, never-ending mercies, and faithfulness to humanity. Okay. Now, just look at the story of salvation, right? You know, there's something beautiful about the story of salvation here, if you really think about it. You know, a father can easily sacrifice his life for his son. But it is a greater love when the father sacrificed the life of his son, right, for strangers. Is that clear? That's why the story, that's how, at least how it's actually what? How it's actually revealed to us, right? When you actually look at what happened in the life of Jesus. That there is this father that instead of sacrificing his own life, right, he sacrificed what? His son, so that he can actually redeem those who are what? Strangers. Do you guys follow me here? If God sacrificed his life, right, the father sacrificed his life, probably it's not going to have the same effect because any father can sacrifice his life, right, for the sake of the son, for example. But when a father sacrifices his son for the sake of strangers, it reveals something. That is the depth of what? God's love for humanity. I hope you guys got that. Now, let's look at the faithfulness of God in the church. You guys know that the church keeps on what? Falling away, right? Keeps on changing. It keeps on, getting influenced by different things. It became imperialistic, blah, 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 right? But somehow God, right, remains what? Faithful to the church. It still continues on. The God of the Bible is the one who fulfills his covenant of love, mercy, and faithfulness, in the lives of what? We see this in the life of Noah. We see this in the life of Abraham. We see this in the life of Isaac. We see this in the life of Jacob. We see this in the life of Joseph. We see this in the nation of Israel. We see this in the life of Moses. We see this in the life of David. We see this in the life of Solomon. We see this in the life of the prophets. We see this in the life of Jesus. We see this in the life of the apostles. We see this in the church. This God, who was actually faithful to them, is the same God who will be faithful to us. You guys get the message here? I hope that makes sense, right? And another thing is this. How do we know that God's love is steadfast and his mercies are never ending and that God is faithful? Through our personal testimonies. Okay. Through our what? Personal testimonies. Our personal lives testify to our own personal experiences of God's steadfast love, never-ending mercies, right, and faithfulness. Okay. We all have our own what? Stories to tell about how God has been what? Faithful to us. I told you my story about how God was faithful to me when I first came here from the Philippines. I came here, I was only 18, and I didn't have any kind of support so that I can go to school. But somehow God actually what? Provided for all of my needs, which is a weird thing. That's something that somehow, even until now, I cannot understand how God somehow provided for me the whole time I was actually in school. And I actually went to expensive schools, which is weird. I didn't have money when I came here. My mom and dad were in the Philippines. I don't have anybody to rely on. I was just simply what? On my own. Does that make sense? And people wonder, how did I end up in a private school in San Diego? How did I end up at Yale? How did I end up in Claremont? But those are all expensive schools. But I didn't get any support from my parents because they were in the Philippines. We're not rich. We're not rich people in the Philippines, like most of you here. You guys are like rich in the Philippines, right? But we're not rich in the Philippines, right? But somehow God has been what? Very faithful, very, very faithful. Now, every time I just think about how God was faithful to me and my wife and my son, even going through the death of our daughter, right? Which is actually, you guys didn't see it, but it was very difficult for me and Florence. Actually, I was crying every time here in the house, right? Every time I think about my daughter, every time my wife, even before we go to sleep, I would just cry loud. Like I was crying like a baby all the time, like every night. And then it's like, I wish I could have spent more time with her. I wish I stayed in the hospital when they said that she might die, anytime soon, right? Because I decided to go home to take a nap. Are you guys following me? Went back, and then I found out he was already dying, and I told Florence I could have stayed there. But you know what? But God has been what? Very, very faithful. My daughter was born ill from she was sick from the time she was born until the time she died. If you have people, if you know people who actually have those kind of children who are severely, with severe mental and physical disabilities, you probably know how we felt. My daughter doesn't sleep. She sleeps like probably 15 minutes at a time, and it's like that 24/7. My wife and I will actually wake up 3 o'clock in the morning, rush her to the hospital. It's happening almost every other week because she was having seizures, right? And then I will have to go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning. It was hard. Sometimes I'll jump off, from the bed, right? Carry her because she was choking on her saliva because she doesn't know how to swallow her saliva, right? And it will happen like constantly. It's not like just once a day. It's happening like pretty much what? The whole entire day, because she requires what? 24-hour care. But God has been very, very faithful. You can ask Florence. Sometimes I admire Florence for how she even managed to what? She managed to do that. She sacrificed her career because she was pursuing, she wanted to become a teacher before. She sacrificed that, right? So that she can take care of her daughter. But you know what? The whole time, God has been very, very what? Faithful, right? Now, we even experienced my wife losing her job, right? But during the whole time, God has always been what? Very faithful. Now, and I cannot, it's hard to explain it. I cannot even explain it. One thing that I always tell people, that my favorite thing about God is that God is what? Faithful, right? That God is faithful. Now, I'm not the only one who have those stories, right? All of us, right? I think most of us have those kind of stories, and I'm assuming you can tell me stories after stories of how God has been faithful to you. Christians should welcome life challenges that will provide them opportunities to experience God's love, God's mercies, and God's faithfulness. Through the challenges that we face in life, we get the chance to see God in action. Every time I seem to be aware that I'm obeying God, for whatever reason, I always see God's what? Faithfulness. Right? Is that clear? So we're almost done. So I'm ending here. So what is living with hope? Living with hope is not merely thinking positively. That's what you get from, those TV evangelists probably, right? They just want you to think what? Positively, okay? But it's not just that, okay? Living with hope in the context of Christian living has a lot to do with our reliance on the goodness of God. Are you guys following me here? Right? It's not just positive thinking. Of course, it probably involves some positive thinking. But there's another element to it, okay? Now, living with hope is not necessarily associated with wishful thinking or self-deception. That's what the atheists will think about Christians in some sense, at least some of them, right? That this is just a form of what? Wishful thinking. That this is just a form of what? Self-deception. That we're just simply deceiving ourselves here, right? Trying to make us feel good, to think positively. But this is not what it is. That's why I said, look at the biblical witness and look at our what? Personal testimonies. Living with hope has to do with having a mental attitude that projects hope that is guaranteed by God, who faithfully fulfills His redemptive task. Living with hope has to do with having what? A mental attitude that projects hope that is guaranteed by God, who faithfully fulfills His redemptive task. You know, in biblical faith, God's goodness is the ground of our hope. Is that clear? It's not just us positively thinking that just by thinking positively, things will happen. Do you guys follow me here? The ground of it is what? God's goodness. You know, God exhibits such goodness in the moments of our lives that serve as remembrances of God. Once in a while, we get the chance. We have the chance of having glimpses of God's faithfulness. Now, I always like to use the word glimpses, right? It's just a glimpse, okay? Because, you know, bad things still happen to us. Do you guys follow me here? But once in a while, we have those what? Glimpses. And that's the reason why we remember God. Because of those what? Glimpses. So we live in the present with the hope, right, for the future as we remember our glimpses of God in the past. That's how we're supposed to live, right, as Christians. We live in the present with the hope for the future as we remember our glimpses of God in what? In the past. Do you guys follow me here? You know, one of the reasons why I returned to the church, right? You know, remember I left the church for a while. You know, this was in I think in the late 90s and early 2000s. I was not. You guys didn't know me during that time. You know, I remember flirting with atheism, agnosticism, right? I remember I didn't really like church at all, right? I was actually opposed to Christ almost, right? I remember one time, you know, Billy Graham was supposed to actually what? Preach on TV. And I even brought a chair right in front of the TV, and I told Florence, I'm going to try to criticize this guy as much as I can because I don't really like what he says, right? And I was just like so eager to actually criticize him. Are you guys following me here? Until, you know, before he preached, you know, the Katina sang, right? It was the Katina. They sang the song like, thank you. And it was so weird, right? While they were singing, I was reminded of what? God's goodness. I was reminded of God's faithfulness. How God actually helped me out like in the past. Because I have those glimpses to actually what? Remember God. Do you guys follow me? And that's the reason why I returned to the church. Actually, that evening, I called Pastor Fred. That's the reason why I started attending Charisma. And I told Pastor Fred, I'll be going to your church tomorrow. Right? Because I told my wife, we're going to church tomorrow. Right? Because for some reason, I just cannot what? You know, I was reminded of these glimpses of God, which is a weird thing. I didn't even listen to Billy Graham. Right? I think I turned off the TV after that. Right? Because I don't even need to hear his preaching. Because I was just like what? Overwhelmed by my memories of God. Now, remember this. In our acts of obedience, that's when God actually what? Moves. And that's the reason why every time you obey, that's every time God reveals something to you. And every time God reveals something to you, you always have something to what? Remember God. You know, in the Old Testament, that's what God always tells the Israelites. Remember what I have done for you in the past. Remember when I did this. Remember when I did that. Remember when I did that. Because part of biblical faith is actually remembering the goodness of God, the faithfulness of God. But you have none of that if you never seek those kind of experiences. Do you guys follow me here? Right? So I hope you guys learned something from that, right? So